It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. McCoo, who is conducting the first part of our presentation today.
Thank you, Nancy, and welcome everybody. Before we get started, we have some disclosures to make. In terms of financial disclosures, the presenters are employed by Pearson Clinical Assessment, the ASHA continuing education provider for this session. We have no relevant non-financial relationships to disclose. In addition, Pearson Clinical Assessment is the sponsor of this webinar, and we develop and distribute assessments and intervention tools for speech-language pathologists. We will cover information that pertains to the effective and appropriate use of the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals preschool developed by Pearson Clinical Assessment. No other assessment will be discussed during this presentation. In terms of the agenda, we will focus the first 30 minutes or so on subtest administration and scoring. We'll discuss for about 10 minutes test development and research, and toward the end, we'll open up for questions and answers. Learning outcomes. After you complete the webinar, and we will provide a handout following the webinar, you will be able to describe at least two differences between CELF Preschool-2 and CELF Preschool-3. You'll also be able to explain how to obtain and score the connected speech sample using the No Juice book, and you'll be able to list at least two subtests that make up the Academic Readiness Index and the Early Literacy Index. And if you're familiar with CELF Preschool-2, you already recognize some components that are new to CELF Preschool-3, and we'll talk about those here in a few seconds. So when you think about CELF Preschool-3, what is CELF Preschool-3? And we know that most of you on with us today are speech-language pathologists. And if you're familiar with CELF Preschool-2 and also with CELF-5, you understand that CELF Preschool-3 is going to be a norm reference instrument that will be administered individually. And its purpose is to assess language and communication skills of children ages 3 through 6 years. And you'll use it to identify, diagnose, and perform follow-up evaluations of language and communication deficits in preschool-age children. So the applications of CELF Preschool-3 will mirror the applications of CELF-5. First, to determine if the child has a language impairment, and if we determine the child does have a language impairment, we can administer additional subtests to determine the nature of the impairment. For example, is the child's impairment related to receptive language, possibly to expressive language, maybe to both, or maybe the impairment is related to the content of language, or maybe to the structure of language. In addition, we're able to evaluate skills that are related to early classroom requirements and to literacy fundamentals. We're also able to evaluate communication in context when we think about the pragmatics of language. So these applications pretty much mirror the applications of CELF-5. We want to think about the subtests, and we want to look at the administration and scoring of the subtests. And when you think about the subtests, you will notice some changes on the subtests. Those of you who are familiar with CELF Preschool-2, you'll find some changes in terms of the subtests. And the revised assessment process, though, will still allow us the opportunity to select and administer only those subtests and checklists that are relevant to whatever specific questions that we have. So the flexibility that we're used to with CELF-5 and CELF Preschool-2 is embedded in CELF Preschool-3 as well. CELF Preschool-3, we want to start by looking at some of the changes from CELF Preschool-2 to CELF Preschool-3. You'll notice there are a few new subtests on CELF Preschool-3. The new subtests are the Connected Speech Sample as well as the Pragmatic Activities Checklist, and we'll talk more about these here in a few minutes. In addition, we offer scaled scores for 3 subtests, and this is new: Phonological Awareness, Preliteracy Rating Scale, and the Descriptive Pragmatics Profile. So you'll be able to generate scaled scores for these 3 subtests as well. We offer 2 new index scores, and I alluded to this when we were talking about the learning outcomes. There are 2 new index scores, the Academic Language Readiness Index and the Early Literacy Index. And we'll go into more detail on each of these here in a few minutes. In addition, when we compare CELF Preschool-3 to CELF Preschool-2, there are a number of subtest improvements. We expanded the floor of the test to provide greater diagnostic value for children ages 3 through 4 years, and we expanded the ceiling of the test to provide greater diagnostic value for children between the ages of 5 years and 6 years. We also modified items based on examiner feedback, and certainly we have updated the norms, and we provide different digital options on our Q Interactive and Q Global platforms. And one of the components about which we're really excited is that we'll be offering the CELF Preschool-3 screening test that will be available separately. So we'll talk about all of these subtest improvements as we work through our presentation today. Some other changes compared to CELF Preschool-2, we have reduced the discontinue rule for several subtests, and we're hoping that this will reduce the formal testing time. We've also reformatted the preschool books, the stimulus books that were part of CELF Preschool-2. CELF Preschool-3 includes just 1 stimulus book, and in all of the stimuli for 7 of our subtests are included in that stimulus book. The No Juice story, that story has been repurposed. It is now a story retell task for the Connected Speech subtest. Those of you who are familiar with CELF Preschool-2, you know that the No Juice book was used as a recalling sentences task on CELF Preschool-2. So what are the administration and scoring options for CELF Preschool-3? Well, like for other assessments, you have 3 different options. You have a print option, a Q Global option, and a Q Interactive option. And when you look at the print option for the administration, you will need the print manual, the print stimulus book, and the print record form. And for scoring, you have 2 options, either using the manual and for scoring, using the lookup tables in the manual for scoring, or you can use the Q Global platform for scoring. For the Q Global option, you'd be using the digital manual and the digital stimulus book, and you would need a web-enabled computer or tablet, and in conjunction, you would use the print record form. For scoring, again, your options are either using the lookup tables in the manual or using Q Global. And then Q Interactive will be Pearson's integrated digital administration scoring and reporting system, for which you will need 2 iPads connected by Bluetooth. So let's look at the subtests on CELF Preschool-3. Over to the left, you will see the 10 subtests that you will use. And again, you have flexibility in terms of the subtests that you'll choose to administer. The subtests that you choose will depend on the questions that you're trying to answer. And you'll notice for each of these 10 subtests, and I mentioned previously, the 3 down at the bottom, we are now offering scale scores for phonological awareness, the descriptive pragmatics profile, and the preliteracy rating scale. For each of the 10 subtests, we'll derive a raw score based on the child's performance, and you'll be able to convert the raw scores to scale scores. You have confidence interval, percentile ranks, age equivalents, as well as growth scale values. Different combinations of these subtests will provide different composites or different index scores. So when we look at the CELF Preschool-3, you'll notice, before I go on to that, let me back up here for a second. I do want to say when we look at the subtests, there are a few changes in terms of subtest names. When you look at the first subtest, for example, sentence comprehension, that was named sentence structure on the CELF Preschool-2. And then the fourth subtest here, following directions, that was named concepts and following directions on CELF Preschool-2. When you look at this particular graphic, we're looking at the subtests over to the left, and then the different composite scores, different index scores that we're able to derive using different combinations of subtests. So the CELF Preschool-3 offers a receptive. The CELF Preschool-3 provides a balance of items across receptive and expressive modalities, and also provide information on language content as well as language structure. And as I mentioned, different combinations of the 10 subtests will yield the different combinations of 7 of the 10 subtests will yield the core language score, receptive language index, expressive language index, as well as a language content index and a language structure index. And then when you think about the 2 new indices that we added, when you look at academic language readiness, 2 of the 7 subtests, expressive vocabulary and following directions, in conjunction with a descriptive pragmatics profile, will provide information for the academic language readiness index. And then the early literacy index, again, a new index, is composed of, okay, let's see what's going on here. The early literacy index over to the right is composed of phonological awareness and the preliteracy rating scale. If we look back at the core language score, you'll notice the 3 subtests that make up the core language score are sentence comprehension, word structure, and expressive vocabulary. So I'm going to try to see if I can get on to my next slide here, which is just, okay. Let's see if I can move on to the next one. All right. So sorry about that little glitch there for a second. Okay. In terms of subtest changes, I kind of alluded to this, that the subtests that are part of CELF Preschool-3, the subtests that were part of CELF Preschool-2, we broadened those in scope. I mentioned the floor and the ceiling. We added some easier items. We added some more difficult items to more adequately cover the range of developmental skills. In terms of the administration time, if you're using just the 3 subtests that will yield your core language score, sentence comprehension, word structure, and expressive vocabulary, should take you between 15 and 20 minutes to administer those subtests. Again, the time it actually takes depends on a number of factors, including the child's age, responsiveness, and then you will select the subtests that you need to answer specific questions, and the administration time again will depend on child's factors, also examiner characteristics, the child's language ability, level of motivation, and the subtest that you select. When you look, for example, at the subtests, you start with sentence comprehension, and for sentence comprehension, we expect the child to identify a picture that matches the sentence read aloud by the examiner. So for example, if I look at this demo item, and you will be using the stimulus book, which will present the pictorial stimuli for the child, and you'll be using a record form, whether you're using the paper record form or you're using the record form either in digital format or if you're using it on Q Interactive. So here, for example, if I present this picture and I present the instructions that are in the stimulus book, I'd say, let's look at these pictures. I'm going to point to the picture that shows I can wear this. And then I point to that picture, and I point to the picture here, point to the shirt, which is B. And the way that the pictures are laid out is really from left to right and top to bottom. So we have them identified as A, B, C, and D, which is what you see projected here on the record form. And so you would tell the child that you are going to point to the picture that shows I can wear this, and then you ask the child to point to the picture that shows I can eat this. And the correct answer is going to be the apple, which is identified in the demo item for you as C. And you could see that the correct response is presented for you in a different color. So let's see if I can get back to my presentation view right here, and then we will go on to what this measures. So just like on CELF Preschool-2, each of these subtests will certainly provide all of the items, but one of the things that we hope you find useful is the item analysis section that we provide for each of the subtests. So the item analysis section will allow us to identify the types of errors that the child is making. So when we think about sentence comprehension, for example, what are the type of sentence structures with which the child is struggling? So here, for example, maybe it is that the child is struggling primarily with adjectives, or maybe with prepositional phrases, or maybe the child is struggling with relative clauses, or maybe with subordinate clauses. So again, once we're able to identify the types of skills with which the child is struggling, we're able to more adequately identify interventions that would be appropriate. We look at the next subtest, word structure. We want the child to complete a sentence using a closed procedure with whatever the targeted structures are. One of the changes that we've made is that we've added some demo items between test items. So if you look at this section of the record form, for example, you could see that we added a demo item after item 13, another one after item 17, another one after item 22, and so on. But the actual items, when we present the items here, again, you're going to be using pictures in the stimulus book, and you'll read the instructions. I'm going to show you some pictures and say some things about them, and I want you to help me by finishing some of the things I say. And then you say, listen, here is a boy, and here, and here, and the child should finish that. And the response that you're expecting is pictured here for you in the record form. The child should say, is a girl. Again, in terms of what this subtest measures, you could see here different kinds of word structures, maybe including prepositions, possessive nouns. When you look at verb tenses, the one that I showed you certainly was the copula, and then you're thinking about maybe other parts of word structures, basically trying to identify why the child earned a relatively low score on that particular subtest. For expressive vocabulary, we want the child to name an object or a person or an activity, and we're going to show the child a picture, and we're going to ask the child to name something presented in that picture. This one contributes to that new academic language readiness index, along with following directions in the Pragmatics profile subtest. And yes, we know you're going to ask, so we're going to tell you we did remove the calculator, the telephone, and the newspaper. So here is a part of the record form for expressive vocabulary. You could see the demo item, and there are 2 trial items. And in this demo item, I would say, look at this picture. This is a bird. And then I'd say, look at this picture. What is this? And the child should say it's a sock, and you would see that that is the correct response for trial 1. So this particular subtest measures words in semantic categories, and these semantic categories reflect the typical language experiences of children in our normative age range, so ages 3 years through 6 years. So you think about items that measure probably verbs, science and math, food and tools, and so on. And then for the next subtest, which is following directions, and I mentioned that we separated following directions from concepts and following directions in CELF Preschool-2 is now following directions, and we also have the basic concepts subtest. On this one, we expect the child to point to pictures in response to oral directions. We did include a new task of following directions by pointing to body parts. So from this section of the record form, you could see for ages 3 and 4, we have a familiarization task where we're asking the child to point to his or her, to point to some part of the body. So point to your head, point to your foot, point to your eye, point to your mouth. And for ages 5 through 6, we have a familiarization task that uses pictures. So point to the cat, the turtle, the elephant, and so on. Notice over to the right that you do not administer the actual test items for following directions if the child does not respond correctly to all parts of the familiarization task. So what is this one measuring? Again, the item analysis section will show you. Definitely from the first column, you could see we look at the number of directions. We also look at the complexity of directions from a 1-level command to a 3-level command, some of which would include modifiers. We also look at the type of command. Are you using a temporal command, conditional command, sequential command? And then we also look at maybe no orientation or serial orientation. So again, you'll be able to identify the specific types of skills with which the child is struggling. Recalling sentences is exactly what you would think it is. The child is going to imitate a sentence spoken by the examiner. So I am going to say, I'm going to read aloud a sentence, and the child is going to listen carefully and say exactly what I say. So I say the dog is eating, the child says the dog is eating. What does this one measure? Again, all of the items would fall into specific categories. Active declarative statements with maybe prepositional phrases, relative clauses, and so on. Some are interrogative, some are passive declarative. So again, is the child struggling with a specific type of skill? Basic concepts, we ask the child to point to a picture that illustrates the targeted concept presented by the examiner. And here, for example, on this one, maybe I present this picture for the demo item, and I'd say, look at these children, and I'm going to point to each of the pictures, and I'd say, this is a baby. The baby is little. This is a girl. The girl is big. And this is a boy. He is big too. And then say, look at the children again, and I point to the little girl and point out that the baby is little. And then I go on to the trial item, which is going to be looking at SAD. Again, what does it measure? You could see here that the concepts on which we're focusing, again, concepts that are appropriate for children within this age range, directional concepts, some positional concepts, certainly attributes, number and quantity, dimension and size, same and different. So again, is the child struggling with concepts in a specific category? And then for word classes, in word classes is going to be that 7th subtest. So the 7 subtests that I'm talking about now are the 7 subtests. Different combinations of those 7 subtests will provide your core language score as well as your receptive, expressive, language content, and language structure indices. So for word classes, the child is going to choose 2 words or pictures that are related from a choice of 3 or 4 words or pictures. And one of the things that you'll notice when you look at word classes on CELF Preschool-3 is that we dropped the expressive section on CELF Preschool-2. We asked the child to explain the relationship between the pair that he or she had selected. We've repurposed that as an extension testing procedure for CELF Preschool-3. So here is an example of an item. This is going to be your demo item for word classes. And on this one, I would present the instructions in the stimulus book. I'm going to say some words and show you some pictures. 2 of the words go together. And I would say these words: bread, shoe, and bread, shoe, apple. And then I would say bread and apple bread and apple are the 2 words that go together best. And you could see on the record form, as you're keeping track, that bread and apple are presented for you in a different color, so you know that those are the correct responses. So again, word classes, pretty much trying to see if the child can put pictorial objects into different categories. So thinking about categorizing and classifying. So when you think about what this one measures, again, you're thinking about different types of categories, whether you're thinking about toys or you're thinking about objects related to the home or animals or food and drink and so on. So again, different categories. So the extension testing, I mentioned that expressive component of word classes was repurposed as an extension testing procedure. And just like on CELF Preschool-2, we offer extension testing on CELF Preschool-3. And effectively, you would use it after you've completed your testing and your interpretation. You'd consider using extension testing to learn more about the factors that may have resulted in the child's relatively lower score. So do the child's errors fall into a specific category? So extension testing really is useful when you think not just about making decisions related to eligibility, but really focusing on need. So what are the objectives that we need to write into an individualized educational plan, for example? The extension testing really will allow us to identify the child's needs. So under what conditions is the child able to perform the skill proficiently? We know the child wasn't able to perform the skill given the conditions of these standardized subtests, but what might be the conditions that would allow the child to perform proficiently? So for example, for word classes, there are some modifications that we suggest. We can ask maybe give the child pictures, ask the child to categorize the pictures by semantic categories. So put all of the fruit into one category, all of the vegetables, all of the meats, and so on. And then you might ask the child to reclassify the pictures by selected attributes or selected characteristics. So again, trying to see if there are conditions under which the child would perform this particular task proficiently, and that will allow us to identify the child's needs and also allow us to program, right, to think through how we might approach instruction for that particular concept or skill. We want to continue now by looking at our two new indices, the Academic Language Readiness Index, and Nancy will talk to us about starting with the Academic Language Readiness Index.
Yes, as soon as I take myself off mute, I'll be happy to do that. So the Academic Language Readiness Index is a new index score for CELF Preschool-3, as Gloria pointed out. And the Expressive Vocabulary, Following Directions, and Descriptive Pragmatics Profile were the three subtests that clustered to look for us to be able to offer this index score. So you're really looking at does the child have certain language skills that enable them to meet the language demands of the classroom? So these were the three subtests that clustered together that we decided to call this particular area, looking at not a child's overall school readiness, but language readiness for the classroom. I'm going to move on to the... Sorry, I'm getting used to this new system we have here. We also have the Descriptive Pragmatics Profile subtest. This subtest was available on CELF Preschool-2, but offered Criterion scores, and now we're able to offer scaled scores for children ages 3 through 6. This is a subtest that looks at children's ability to do the appropriate communication, the appropriate social communication behaviors that most children their age do. This contrasts with, all right, I'm going on too fast. Here's some examples of what's on the Descriptive Pragmatics Profile. You'll see that on the test form, there are a number of behaviors that are looking at nonverbal communication skills, conversational routines and skills, and asking for, giving, and responding to information. So the items have been reworded somewhat. We think they're easier for parents and teachers to give you information about a child's performance in the classroom or at home without you having to translate the speeches that we use sometimes on our forms. So you'll be marking whether the child always or almost always does this behavior, if they do it often, sometimes, never, or almost never, or that the behavior is not appropriate either for the child's age, you feel, or that it's really not appropriate considering their cultural background. So when I was going to talk about the contrast, the Descriptive Pragmatics Profile is a list of behaviors that you would expect to see for a child between ages 3 and 6. The Pragmatics Activities Checklist is similar to the test on CELF 5. So if you're familiar with CELF 5, you'll know that these behaviors are lists of atypical behaviors that you might see. You have a choice of a number of interactive tasks to do with the child before, during, or after testing. If you want to have the child do a little break during testing and choose one of those activities, you can do it then, or you can save it for the end. You might even try it at the beginning if you're having difficulty establishing rapport. But you'll be checking off behaviors that are not typical behaviors of children at that age level. This is a Criterion referenced checklist, and you won't be getting a score for that particular one. So here's some examples of the activities you choose for when you're working with a child. You'll be choosing 3 either during the session or as part of extension testing. You can do an art activity, have a snack with the child and talk with them during the snack, play with toys, put something together. For older children, you can teach and play a game or talk about a movie from a website. But you're looking at these, you'll be checking off behaviors in these areas that you see on the slide: nonverbal behaviors, verbal behaviors that have to do with manner of communication. How did they communicate, and what atypical things did you see during your interactions with the child? Relevance of the communication. So sometimes we test much more verbal children, but their verbalizations are not necessarily relevant to the situation at hand. And finally, the quality and quantity of verbal behavior. The Early Literacy Index is a new index, although the two subtests that comprise them are not new to CELF Preschool. What is new is that standard scores are offered for both the Phonological Awareness test and the Preliteracy rating scale. So those two pieces will enable you to find calculate a literacy index for children ages 4 through 6. For children below age 4, even though there's some early literacy skills that many 3-year-olds have, we didn't find that consistently across the board, depending on the quantity and quality of children's pre-literacy experiences. So this particular index is only available for 4 to 6-year-olds. So on the phonological awareness task, you'll see that here are some demo and trial items for a couple of the areas. Those of you who are already familiar with CELF Preschool-2 know that there are quite a few segments, short 2 to 4 item segments that look at a large number of phonological awareness tasks. Here's an example of the pre-literacy rating scale and a couple of items from them. The pre-literacy rating scale looks at early reading skills and early writing skills, starting with just being able to hold a book right side up, turn the pages, things like that. Find specific items in the book, either page numbers or the name of the author, depending on the child's age. The early writing skills, of course, look at the child's ability to use a pencil or crayon to write or scribble, but then to write to their name and maybe to write simple words for the older children. This scale is similar to what you saw for the Pragmatics profile, in that you're doing a rating that the child always or almost always does some of these skills, often, sometimes, never, or almost never does those skills, or that it would not be appropriate for some reason for the child to do that skill. And you'll obtain a standard score. And I mentioned the scaled scores. The connected speech sample is a brand new test for CELF Preschool. It provides criterion scores and descriptive information for children ages 3 through 6. So Gloria mentioned earlier that there's the No Juice book is the same story with some changes, but mostly the same story that was on CELF Preschool-2, but it's been redone as a story retell task rather than a sentence imitation task. So what you'll be doing is presenting the book and reading the story to the child, telling the story to the child, and then when it's over, ask the child to retell the story. You'll be using the record form to write the child's responses, and you'll use those responses to score a number of things on the test. What we're looking at here are elements of macrostructure and microstructure in a narrative production. So you'll be rating story organization, recalling facts and details, story grammar, and language structures used. Macrostructure in a narrative refers to the key components and overall organization of a story. So there'll be a score for the use of story grammar and qualitative descriptions of story organization and recall as part of the connected speech sample analysis. Microstructure looks at linguistic productivity and complexity at the level of utterances or sentences. So there'll be a table in the record form for you to be able to note the use of linguistic structures and compare that performance with their performance on the word structure subtest. The CELF Preschool Connected Speech Sample Scoring can be used in conjunction with further analysis depending on your professional judgment. And this is something that's a supplemental subtest. You wouldn't necessarily give it maybe as part of your initial diagnostic set of tests. And this is so we set this book up more like a storybook. It has a new cover, but much of the story within it is the same as CELF Preschool-2. So there's and it's actually still a work in progress because we're working on, right now we're in the midst of a usability study, and we have examiners in the field trying out the record form and the materials to see if everything is clear and they know what to do with the scoring on this. We've actually changed the story organization section that you see here to delete the first bullet. Actually for both story organization and recalling facts and details. So we won't have a bullet about adequately developed for age. We're keeping the descriptors below that explain kind of the transition of a child from a very early beginning stage to emerging, that maybe the child uses certain, does some of these behaviors inconsistently, is going from little or no organization to a much cohesive pattern of at least talking about some aspects of the story in some details are provided, or you start out with a clear beginning, but you may or may not have all of the pieces of beginning, middle, and end, and then acceptable with the child showing that there's a recognizable pattern. So even though young children may not provide all the details of the story and all the specifics that you've read to them, their resulting story is a pretty good synopsis of what's going on. The connected speech sample analysis, oh, and I didn't mention what all the clinician is doing for story organization and recalling facts and details is that you'll be circling the description that best captures the performance of the child in retelling the story. You'll go on to complete the connected speech sample analysis by looking at the story grammar and the language structures. So there's a closer look at that here, though it doesn't include all the details that are on the record form. So you're looking at aspects like, did they have a title for the story? What was this? Did they describe the setting, the characters? Were they able to convey the main idea and some of the events? And the numbers you see on the right, we list the possible details and settings and characters that the child might mention. So you'll have a list of them on the record form, and you'll circle those and add up the number of points that the child gets as part of the story retell for a total raw score of 66. That particular piece offers a Criterion reference score, and you'll be able to compare the child's raw score on this prior piece, on this piece, to the performance of children in the standardization sample. 3 and 4-year-olds, they're grouped by 3 to 4-year-olds and 5 and 6-year-olds. When you're looking at the language structures, you'll be comparing how did the child do on mostly Brown's grammatical morphemes, but there's some additional ones towards the bottom. How did the child do on the word structure subtest items? And did you see evidence of the child using those structures in the no juice story retell? So you'll see on the right where it says examples from the no juice story. These are the things that are actually in the story, but of course, we all know in a spontaneous, it's not completely a spontaneous task, it's a structured story retell, but children may use those structures in sentences other than what was in the story, and you can give them credit for that. You'll see at the top that the key for the check boxes on the right is that beginning, you didn't observe any correct productions. Emerging, you saw at least one correct production of the language structure, and acceptable would be more than 90% correct out of the productions that you heard from the child. You know, if you would choose to supplement the child's productions from the word structure, subtest, and the no juice story with spontaneous utterances during the assessment, we all write notes on the record form during an assessment. You can count those as well and total those as well. This particular piece is descriptive, not criterion reference, so you can use any of the utterances that the child produces anytime during the session. You're really just trying to get a feel for how does the child do in a story retell task, a very structured task, and then totally spontaneous task, so that you don't overinterpret the results from any of those formats. Of course, on all our self-assessments, CELF assessments, there's guidance on how to score dialectal variations on the word structure, expressive vocabulary, recalling sentences, and connected speech sample. So certainly responses on any of those tests can contain regional or cultural patterns or variations that are different from standard American English, and those should not be counted as incorrect if the child is a dialect speaker. So you'll see examples of those in the Appendix A in the manual to help you score those correctly.
So
Gloria,
in terms of this,
back up.
Okay.
No, I was just asking if this was where you picked this back up.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the scores, you'll be familiar with these charts. Certainly for each of our 10 subtests, you'll be able to derive a scaled score, and the scaled scores will be familiar: mean of 10, standard deviation of 3. We also mentioned the different composite score and the core language score, as well as the index scores, which will have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. Again, as Nancy mentioned, some of these components of the record form are in process. So when these are finalized, there might be some differences. In addition to those standardized scores, we mentioned the scale score and the composite score. I'll refer to it as a standard score. There will also be some criterion scores. For example, as Nancy was mentioning, for the connected speech sample, we'd use specific criterion scores to compare the child's raw score, and then also for the pragmatic activities checklist, we will identify the child's skills as either meeting or not meeting a specific criterion. In addition to these standardized scores and the criterion scores, you also can document qualitative information on the record form. The behavioral observation checklist is included on the record form, and certainly you'll be able to document information about the child's physical activity level, whether or not the child became fatigued, maybe the child's level of interaction. Did the child speak quite a bit? What about attention to task? So those behaviors can be recorded and documented so that you can integrate that information when you're interpreting. We want to say a few words about test development and research, and certainly beginning with the characteristics of our standardization sample. And I think there was a question that came in through the chat box, and I think that the information here will probably answer that question. Our normative sample included 700 children, also included some additional children for reliability and validity studies. The normative sample for each of the age bands, which you see listed here, each included 100 children, and all children spoke English as their primary or home language. As you could see from this graphic, the sample was stratified by age, by parent or caregiver education level, by race or ethnicity, by geographic region, and by sex. And the stratification was matched to the U.S. population as determined by the U.S. Census Bureau. When we look at some of the data based on the performance of the children in our standardization sample, for the overall normative sample, the average split half reliability coefficients range from 0.80 for the sentence comprehension subtest to 0.97 down at the bottom for the preliteracy rating scale. And overall, the reliabilities for each subtest are good to excellent. When we look at the reliabilities for the composites over here to the right, you'll see that those reliabilities, again, are excellent, ranging from 0.92 to 0.95. We also established reliability for a sample of students who were diagnosed or classified with a language impairment, and at the subtest level, you could see that those reliabilities range from 0.89 to 0.99 for the subtest. We also looked at validity evidence, and one of the components I want to point out, and certainly we'll have additional validity evidence in the manual for CELF Preschool-3, but when we looked at the sensitivity and specificity values, and those are the only components of validity I'm going to talk about here today, the sensitivity and specificity values here indicate that the CELF Preschool-3 is a good assessment for identifying children with a possible language impairment when used in conjunction with other measures. So if you look at the cut score of 77, which is 1.5 standard deviations below the mean, that is the cut score that results in the best balance between sensitivity and specificity. So if you're thinking about maybe if you're using this cut point, you could see that we would have a sensitivity of 89%, identifying 89% of children with a language impairment, and a specificity value of 0.87 or 87%. Other characteristics when we think about our technical properties, we always want to establish the relationship between the current edition of the tool and the previous edition. And when we look at the corrected correlations of CELF Preschool-3 and CELF Preschool-2, looking at the composite scores here, you notice that those are high. Looking at the core language composite, the corrected reliability coefficient is 0.86. And typically when we think about the purposes for which we use a tool like CELF Preschool-3, we use composite scores to make diagnostic decisions, to make decisions related to the types of services that the child would need. So this high correlation between composite scores is a good indicator that children's classifications would be similar either using CELF Preschool-2 or using CELF Preschool-3. We also conducted, as I mentioned, a special group study. We administered the CELF Preschool-3 to 79 children ages 3 years through 6 years who were diagnosed with a language impairment. And what we do is we compare the performance of children identified with a language impairment to the performance of children in a matched control group, so matched on different demographic characteristics. And then what we want to take a look at is the standard difference. So we want to see compare the mean scores for children in the language impairment group to the mean scores of children in the matched control group. And the standard difference, if you look at that effect size, we're looking to see if those coefficients would be 0.80 or greater, which would tell us that those effect sizes are large. And you'll notice in the standard difference column that all of those effect sizes are greater than 0.80, indicating that the performance of the children who were already diagnosed with a language impairment, their performance was significantly lower than that of children in the matched control group. So again, indicating that the tool is going to contribute to information that we need to diagnose children with language impairments. Just to sum this up, at the beginning we mentioned that we wanted you to be able to describe at least two differences between CELF Preschool-2 and CELF Preschool-3. We talked about the new subtests, the connected speech sample, and the pragmatic activities checklist. We talked about the subtest that now includes scaled scores, phonological awareness, the descriptive pragmatics profile, as well as the preliteracy rating scale. And we talked about two new indices, the academic language readiness index and the early literacy index. When we look at the learning outcome 2, explaining how to obtain and score the connected speech sample using the No Jizz book, we talked about reading aloud the story to the child, asking the child to retell the story, documenting the child's retelling, and then calculating a raw score for story grammar, and then looking at language structures. And then the last one was to list at least two subtests that make up the academic readiness index, and certainly those would be expressive vocabulary, following directions, and the descriptive pragmatics profile. And then for the early literacy index, phonological awareness, and pre-literacy rating scale. So in terms of questions and answers, there were a few questions that came in the chat box, and I am going to try to respond to one of these, and maybe Nancy, you can help me. One of the questions was about extension testing, and I want to say for extension testing, I provided an example of extension testing for the word classes subtest, but we include in the manual different activities that you might want to use as part of extension testing for all of the subtests, and really the purpose of extension testing is to be able to identify why the child might have struggled with a particular subtest, but more importantly, trying to help us to identify if we make modifications in terms of maybe the response demand or the input demand for the child, might the child be able to perform proficiently. So anything to add to that, Nancy?
No, I think that was great. The only thing I would add is, especially in a MTSS environment where a child may not qualify for services but did not score particularly high, perhaps they only missed the eligibility criteria by a few points, and the rest of your testing did not support including the child in a speech and language program, then you have some information about what could facilitate better performance for the teacher to try in the classroom.
Okay, thank you. And there was also a question about demos. How important are the demos? And Michelle, I'm going to make an assumption that you are referring to those demo items, but if we're wrong on that, if you could put that into the chat box. So each of the subtests will have some demonstration items, some at the beginning, some throughout, and the purpose of demonstration items is to make sure that the child understands the task. So if that was the question, then yes, the purpose is really to make sure the child understands the task. There were some other questions that came. Go ahead, Nancy.
No, sorry. I was just going to say that the demonstration and trial items are especially important for the very young children that are being tested on CELF Preschool. So by the time children are school age, they're much more familiar with those kinds of testing formats and tests, but not necessarily at ages 3 3 and 4 especially, but even some kids who might be new to a school environment at age 5, or a child who's struggling at age 6. So you're really making sure, as Gloria said, that they understand the task, and especially if you have a child who hasn't had daycare or school experiences, you need to make sure that they're knowing what you're asking them to do.
Yeah, thank you. So there are some other questions in the chat box, and we will respond to those individually. And if we think that there are some questions that we should make sure everybody gets the answers to, we'll share out that information as well. But just to be cognizant of our time, if you have any additional questions about CELF Preschool-3, certainly you can access pearsonassessments.com. You can find information there. And if you have specific questions about the webinar, please send them to Nancy, and her email address is here. And then as a reminder, if you need ASHA CEUs, you follow the instructions that we presented. And we'll send out the handout after this webinar, and the handout will include the instructions for ASHA CEUs. Nancy?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Gloria. I think you covered everything.
Okay, thanks,
about
everybody.
the CEUs. Great. All right,
thanks. Okay, thanks, everybody, for joining us.